lecture, U.S.-Cuba, Is There Room for Two Nationalisms So Close to Each Other by Michael Parmly. And it's a great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, although as you will find, he's going to be challenged to speak to you because he has no voice, but he'll be whispering to you his presentation. So just to be very brief, it's wonderful to have Michael back to FIU. He's been here several times, and we consider him a member of our family. A few biographical details would include the fact that he's a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who lives now with his wife outside Geneva, Switzerland. He had a 33-year-old career that took him to both Western and Eastern Europe, North Africa, South Asia, and the Caribbean, as well as senior positions in the U.S. Department of State. And of course, one of his last diplomatic postings, and the main reason why he's here, is that he was chief of mission at the U.S. Interest Section in Havana, Cuba, from 2005 to 2008. So it's a great opportunity to hear him talk about his thoughts about U.S.-Cuba relations. Presently, Mr. Parmly serves on the board of Fundación Amistad, and we have the president of the Fundación here, Luli Duke, and is a member of the Cuba Study Group. He also is a vice president of the American International Club in Geneva, and has worked after his retirement as Foreign Affairs Officer to the Foreign Minister of Kosovo. Advisor, okay. Also has lectured widely in Switzerland and the United States, as well as other academic institutions in Europe and the United States. Most recently, he's been focusing, I would say, almost obsessed with the issue of nationalism in Cuba, and has written very eloquently on that topic. More recently, he published an article on nationalism and the role of Guantanamo in the U.S.-Cuban relationship in the Fletcher Forum of World Affairs. He holds several academic degrees, including 2 master's degrees from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, a BA at St. Joseph University in Philadelphia, where he spent a semester abroad in Mexico City, and also has taught at the National War College in Washington, D.C., and lectured on topics of his interest in Bogotá, Colombia. And one final point is that Michael's son, Chris, is an FIU student, graduate student here. When is he graduating? Soon, hopefully?
November, December.
November, December this year. So again, welcome, Michael, and it's great to have you here.
Sorry, I don't have a voice, but I have an interest in the topic. So anytime that Jorge asks me to do something, I'm inclined to answer yes. And anytime I can talk about Cuba, I'm inclined to answer yes. So I had 2 reasons for wanting to do this. I was here in Miami because Luli Duke, the president of Fundación Amistad, of which I'm on the board, we're doing activities to help Cuba and the Cuban-American relationship, the relationship between Cubans and Americans, which I think is the core mission of the Fundación Amistad, and I'm proud to be on the board can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? I mean, I know I sound like Marlene Dietrich, whispering in your ear, but I don't want to force my voice, and if so long as my throat doesn't hurt, it means I'm not really forcing my voice. But if there's a point that you want me to go over because you didn't quite hear, or if you want me to speak to any specific subject in Spanish or in French, I'd be willing to do that. You've heard the subject that Dr. Dworny and I worked out. It seemed to me that talking about the subject of nationalism, apart from the fact that I've been hounding Jorge on this subject for several years, was a useful topic to talk about, especially at this moment. I mean, tomorrow there's going to be the 4th round of the talks, and to me, it's really an important topic. I was worried after the first round of the talks that not enough attention had gone into the subject of nationalism in the respect of each side for the other side's nationalism. And then with Dr. Duane's help, I started looking into, because I said, all right, fine, if you're interested in talking about the subject of nationalism, Parmly, you've got to write an article. Isn't that right? You have to write an article. And in order to write an article, I needed to come up with a good definition of nationalism. And with Jorge's help and the help of some other professors, I was looking at the subject of nationalism, the classic literature of nationalism. And I wasn't satisfied with any of the models I came up with, how they addressed the Cuban case. They're more addressed to the 19th century, they're more addressed to Europe, or they're more addressed to the Third World, sort of the revolutions of Bandung and in the 1950s and 60s. It didn't quite come to speak to the Cuban case, it seemed to me. So I decided, in preparing for this talk, and with all the permission of Dr. Duane, who's a distinguished academician, and others like my good friend Dr. Frank Mora, with whom I taught at National War College. I tried to come up with elements that I would use if I was seeking to define nationalism insofar as it addresses the Cuban case. Since I find that a lot of people don't like talking about nationalism, they identify it way too much with the 19th century or the horrors of the 20th century, or identify it with Nazi socialism, National Socialism. So, okay, let's not talk about nationalism. Let's talk about identity. Will you accept identity as a rough equivalent of nationalism for what I'm trying to address? I see these as the basic ingredients, and you can count, I enumerate them as 7. First one is history. History for sure, what happened to a country since it began thinking of itself as a whole. Second, the makeup of the population, how they came to the country, how they interacted since they've arrived at the country. And race has a great deal to do with this second criteria, this second issue. And there, I think both Cuba and the United States have very mixed records on the issue of race. But, okay, let's get past that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Third, geography, it seems to me, is central in any country's self-perception. And I suppose when you're talking about nationalism, it's not so much identity, you're talking about self-perception. Look at Russia, if we're talking about the criteria of geography. Russia, which stretches across 11 time zones. So of course, any Russian is going to have a strong sense of identity. Or on the other end of the spectrum, Luxembourg, which is surrounded by all these great countries that never give a second thought to the Grand Duchy unless the issue of banking secrecy arises. Okay, the third criteria, or fourth criteria, the economy, for sure. A self-satisfied population will have far fewer issues with identity than one which has to worry about where the next meal is coming from. Workers rioting over labor conditions in a country, or wage levels, can seriously affect a country's self-image, and thus self-definition. So that's sort of a fourth element of nationalism. Relations with neighbors. Here in shaping the nationalist mindset, this can often be the most critical. And again, it has a great deal to do with the Cuban case. But we're not yet talking about Cuba. So as I think back to my Afghan experience, where Afghans speak consistently, have difficulty defining what it means, what made an Afghan an Afghan. Is an Afghan Pashtun, Tajik, Uzbek, Hazara? So it's more tribal than national in the case of Is it Sunni or Shia? Don't ask the Hazaras. So, to what extent is relations with neighbors? Why is it important in the Afghan case? Because what creates Afghan identity is its relations with outside of Afghanistan. What created the Afghan mindset is when there's an enemy from outside of Afghanistan. So again, I think this has a great deal to speak to the Cuban case. Or, you know, let's talk about Mexico. What Mexican can define himself without reference to the United States? I think culture is another important component of identity and of nationalism. That would start with music, literature, movies and television, painting and sculpture, and food. Who could think about an Italian identity without talking about spaghetti or pizza, or France without good wine? I mean, all of these elements go into an identity, and if you talk to a Frenchman about wine, you better believe that that Frenchman is going to get pretty nationalistic. And pretty, if you start criticizing French wine, they'll take it as an assault on French identity or on French nationalism. Thanks, Wayne. Finally, I think self-confidence has a great deal to do with identity or with nationalism. Some would call it arrogance. Belief in yourself and in your destiny might be a better way of describing it, a more benign way of describing it. So now I'm ready to look at US and Cuba. We Americans like to think that we have no issues with identity, so okay, fine. But we don't like to call ourselves a nationalist country. But in fact, I think that's what we are. And if you look at the 7 factors I cited, you can explain that facile reaction, why Americans have strong nationalist feelings or strong feelings of identity. First of all, we shaped our own history. Second, on geography, once we reached the Pacific Ocean in the second half of the 19th century, we had defined ourselves geographically, and that gave us a space to occupy, and therefore an identity to shape. With the usual ups and downs, the US economy is sound, the leader of the world. Yes, our relations with neighbors and even with the world can be an issue, but the US, with its military strength and its broad diplomatic relations, can hold its own there. When it comes to culture, the US, movies and television, McDonald's and Coca-Cola, and even in the realm of painting and music, is in a league of its own. And I say this with all due respect to France, but I think the United States is in a world of its own, in a league of its own, and has been since the beginning of the 20th century. Finally, our self-confidence can rise and fall. But generally, we like to think of ourselves as positive, as optimistic. I think that defines us as Americans. Now notice, as I've gone down this list, I skipped over the makeup of the population. And I think in the wake of Ferguson, in the wake of Baltimore, in the wake of things like this, or if you've read Samuel B. Huntington, you realize that this is very much a live issue. As it is with Cuba. And I think it's one of the outstanding issues. Frank and Jorge, I think this would be one of the outstanding issues to look at, the makeup of the population. But I'm not concerned about what makes an American an American. And to me, this is my own personal view, to me, the more diverse, the better. However, as we shot past the 300 million mark in population, as Hispanics have passed even blacks as the largest minority, as Asians have continued to flood in, especially wealthy Asians, we continue to grapple with the legacy of the Civil War and its aftermath. The future makeup of America is shifting. But still, I return to my original point. My working assumption for this discussion is that the United States has no real issues with its identity. Cuba cannot say the same. Never could. I think you've got 2 Cubas at this point, the eastern side of the island and the western side of the island, on almost every single criterion. identified, Cuba has problems on all but one, that of self-confidence. So let's review the criteria. So why do they have problems? First of all, so much of Cuba's history has been mortgaged to the United States. From its very birth as a nation, at the beginning of the last century. Think of the Platt Amendment and what it said about Cubans' ability to control their own destiny. However, that did not send, the Platt Amendment did not send Cubans to cower in the corner. On the contrary, the Cuban identity was forged very much in the shadow of that Platt Amendment until 1933-34, when Roosevelt was able to lift the Platt Amendment, except for Article 7 of the Platt Amendment. But I won't bore you with my thoughts on Guantanamo. Raul is writing the latest chapter on Cuban history. But even in the 1920s and 1930s, Cuban leaders, including Machado and even Batista, who people think of as having had good relations with the United States, had very challenging exchanges with the United States. I think Cuban history is very much an open question. Geography is not something you can modify. When I think of what Porfirio Diaz said in the late 19th century about our largest southern neighbor, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States, I think that could just as easily be said about Cuba. Cuba never had a manifest destiny to fulfill. It's always been an island, and has at times suffered as a result when storms and hurricanes lash its shores, when drought dries up its agriculture. Cuba never even had a fishing industry to speak of to take advantage of its island status. So geography is not Cuba's friend, but maybe it can be. I'll get to that. The Cuban economy has long been fragile. Long before the Cuban leadership back in the 60s and 70s took the Cuban economy into the tank. It's been entirely too dependent on an outside actor or another, whether it was Spain, the United States, Russia, or Venezuela. For way too long, entirely too reliant on a single crop, usually sugar. Now, the problem, by Raul's own admission, is the double currency established by Fidel to get back at the U.S. Well, look at the mess that Fidel passed to his brother. Sometimes I'm inclined to feel sorry for Raul and for the present Cuban leadership. But this talk isn't about feeling sorry for Cuba. So let's bracket the makeup of the population. The first criteria, I think, really are to Cuba's disadvantage when it comes to developing and asserting the country's identity, the country's nationalism. The next three, however, that I cited, I think Cuba can stand at least as tall as the United States. And that's what I would like this talk to focus on. That's what I would like this talk to end on. Where Cuba could truly deal with the United States as an equal, where the United States would have every interest cooperating closely with Cuba in elements that make up Cuban nationalism, that make up the Cuban identity, and that we needn't fear. Relations with neighbors. Revolutionary Cuba started out in a hole on this one. The U.S. was determined to isolate the new revolutionary government after 1959. And for a while we succeeded. Cuban membership in the OAS was suspended in 1962, right? With only Mexico, another country which has its own history of issues with the neighbor to the north, voting against Cuba's suspension. Over time, however, Cuba, and especially Cuban diplomacy, worked very hard and successfully on building ties with neighbors. Cuba's medical diplomacy has been extraordinarily successful in many parts of the world. So too has been its educational diplomacy or its sports diplomacy. Now every fall, when the UN resolution on the US embargo on Cuba comes to a vote, the US is lucky to have its own vote, plus that of Israel and Palau, to oppose the condemnation. The sympathy for Cuba has ebbed and flowed over the years, but at present, it is arguably at its highest point. But it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game for the United States. It certainly needn't. It hasn't been in the past, and it need not be so in the future. On the contrary, there have been recent examples of U.S.-Cuban cooperation to help the Caribbean and Latin neighbors, or beyond that, in dealing with the Ebola crisis in Africa. Officials as high as Barack Obama and John Kerry and Raul Castro are on record acknowledging and praising the efforts of the other in dealing with the Ebola crisis. The record of hurricane response in Cuba and the United States is a case of missed opportunity. I can say that as the former chief of mission of the U.S. Interest Section. But it wasn't that there wasn't interest in working on disaster response on the part of both sides. It would be useful to work toward that goal. And if cooperating on disaster response make both Cubans and Americans feel good about themselves, all the better. My point being, we needn't fear Cuban nationalism. We needn't fear Cuba's assertion of its identity. It can be a very positive factor for the United States as well. Culture is a second area where Cuba has as much to give as the United States. Whether it's literature, Cecilia Valdez always ranks for me alongside any work of Gabriel Garcia Marquez in terms of what it says about the society in which it's set. I mean, you can't read Cecilia Valdez without really understanding Cuban society in the 19th century, as much as Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude said about Colombian society in the 19th and then into the 20th century. Or fast forward to Leonardo Padura. No, Cuba holds its own when it comes to literature. Let's talk about music. Who has not heard of Buena Vista Social Club? Or decades before that, Benny Moré. Or more contemporary, Robertico Fonseca. Did you say art? Ask Picasso what he thought of Wilfredo Lau. But we needn't look back. It's only a matter of time before contemporary Cuban artists like Pedro Pablo Bolívar, or Los Carpinteros, or Juan Capote, who's always been my favorite, or Sandra Ramos, who's always been my wife's favorite, assume the same stature as the finest contemporary artists in the world. If you don't believe it, just fly down to Havana tomorrow, as I'm going to do, for this year's Biennale. Or dance. Alicia Alonso is who everyone thinks of as the sort of emblem of Cuban dance. But she's older. Think of Carlos Acosta and what he did when he got to London. My favorite in the dance world is List Alfonso, and I dare you to leave one of her performances of her dance company in anything but a trance. But she would be the first to say that there are many on her level on the island. So when it comes to the arts, my point is, when it comes to the arts, Cuba is doing just fine, thank you. The United States may be the center of artistic production in the world. I'd like to think so. But we needn't fear the Cuban production. On the contrary, we can see that as very much in our interest. I mean, look at the success of Ry Cooder and his Buena Vista Social Club. And I know Ry Cooder was a Canadian, but you get my point. Cuba is succeeding in the arts can only be to the advantage of both countries and thus of the entire world. Self-confidence can be an area of contention and even of confrontation. Americans are who we are. Believe me, my wife who's French hears that every day. And that won't change. The same for Cubans. I was never sure at what point Cubans began to see themselves as the belly button of the universe, but they sure do now. Now, I was having a discussion with someone yesterday evening, and she said, no, I think Cubans are down on themselves. Look, Cubans may be down on themselves, but they're still so Cuban. And that hasn't changed. No matter what has happened, that hasn't changed. I mean, you scratch that Cuban, and you know, you'll get the pride expressing itself in being Cuban. I was told before I went down to Cuba in 2005, beware of Cuban arrogance, which I thought was a funny thing to say. I mean, I was going down as George W. Bush's representative, and we had just invaded Iraq. But, okay, people said beware of Cuban arrogance. Okay, I could take that, and it didn't bother me. If anything, I found that almost an endearing quality. I didn't like the fact that Cubans have a hard time saying thank you and meaning it. But if that's the only price that I had to pay when I was down in Cuba for all the genius and creativity I sensed on the island or off, the Cuban diaspora is truly the eighth wonder of the world, then we're getting off real cheap. So if it was arrogance, it succeeded for an awful lot of Cubans, but also for the rest of the world. To take just one example, look at what the Bacardi family was able to accomplish. And I'm sorry, you may drink Havana Club, but it can't compare to Bacardi. And if you read the history of the Bacardi family and talk to the Bacardis nowadays, they really contributed something, and they're still contributing something. That is Cuban nationalism. So I'm willing to take that Cuban self-confidence, and I hope the Cubans will understand mine and ours. So where does that leave us? Should we fear Cuban nationalism identity as a threat to who we are? I hope not. I think only to Samuel P. Huntington would view someone else's nationalism as sort of a threat to ours. And I'm not even sure, may God have mercy on Samuel P. Huntington's soul, since he's no longer with us. But it's my thesis that we should take advantage of the new era in U.S.-Cuban relations to build whole new areas of cooperation. It's precisely the self-confidence that Cuban nationalism gives the people of the island and off the island that makes them ideal partners for a people as self-confident as we Americans. Now, a final point. We Americans need to be careful. This is a point that my wife often reminds me of. My French wife, and she's never taken American citizenship. We're a lot bigger and wealthier than Cuba, and with that power comes responsibility. There's a lot of history between our two countries, and it wasn't always pretty. Virtually since the founding of the U.S. Republic in the late 18th century, there have been Americans gazing south at the island of Cuba. Part of the reason was the relative weakness, shall we call it fading, of the Spanish colonial power, especially in the early 19th century when Spain lost virtually its entire colonial dominion, all but Cuba. Okay, it still held on to Puerto Rico and the Philippines, but ask any Spaniard in the 19th century, the crown jewel was Cuba. And by the way, Spaniards still think that today. That covetous sense affects a country's self-perception. It can't help but affect a country's self-perception. We need to be sensitive to that. The perfect summation of that relationship was the Platt Amendment. But worse than the Platt Amendment, the words of the Platt Amendment itself, it was the attitude that underlined that language that was put in the Cuban Constitution in 1902. I won't go through the litany of why U.S. governments have had trouble with Cuba over the past 56 years. This is a talk about looking to the future, not about looking to the past. But it seems to me that with Cuban ports as close to the United States, or certainly to a large percentage of major American ports, with as many Americans trying to get to Cuba as there are Cubans wanting to visit the United States, with our history of the past century and a half as intimately intertwined as it is, there is no reason for us not to be close partners. Let me close with just one example. The idea wasn't mine, but rather that of a very wise Salvadoreño who had been living in Cuba for quite a while as the UN representative of the Food and Agriculture Organization. I'll summarize, I'll paraphrase the argument he made to me. Cuban agriculture is not a competitor for U.S. agriculture. Your growing seasons are different. Florida's citrus growers could pour money into Cuban agriculture. Cuban oranges and grapefruit are ready for market at a different time than Florida oranges and grapefruit. Florida citrus growers therefore could corner the U.S. market, investing in Cuba, developing the Cuban citrus market, or other agricultural products, almost permanently. You'd have a block on the market if you were to cooperate positively with Cuba. The idea may be far-fetched, but if one of you in the audience, if there's any student in the audience, and wants to, who's good at marketing, and wants to take that idea and run with it, go ahead, I'm in charge. I think it's a brilliant idea. I think what Cuba needs at this point is investment in agriculture and in infrastructure. And there, if you don't see the advantages that Americans could bring if the Cubans would have us, they've got to get the investment code right. And so far they haven't. But the potential is only positive. I'll end there. Thanks. If there are any questions, I'd be delighted. Frank, please.
Thank you, Michael, again, for your remarks and for some of the things you've written lately since you've left government. So as always, you've forced me to grapple with some key issues. Let me throw a hypothesis at you and have you react to it. Right? And that is that the greater the level or intensity of a relationship between a strong and weaker, right? The greater the asymmetry, the more intense the social, cultural, economic tie, the more likely that the weaker partner will have these identity challenges. If you accept that hypothesis, then as long as those asymmetries exist, and as those links deepen, this issue of identity will persist and become a problem or an obstacle towards not normal diplomatic relations, but to normal relations.
I agree with your hypothesis, and I agree with your conclusion. Here's the issue, though. I think Cuban nationalism is an asset for us and will help us get past that problem. Cubans feel good about themselves. Josefina Vidal, when she walks into the room with Roberta Jacobson tomorrow, she feels good about herself. I know Josefina Vidal very well. She's going to feel good about herself. And that's not a disadvantage. And fortunately, Roberta Jacobson, who I also know very well, doesn't take it as bad. I want to have a self-confident interlocutor, and I think I'll get on a better relationship with you precisely because you're self-confident. If you walk in cowering, then I'm not going to be able to figure you out. I'm going to be wondering where your next punch is going to be coming from, because you're going to be defending your position.